This is breaking news from DawgNation.
Good evening, DawgNation. Finally, the college basketball game has come to an end, which means we did actually get some college basketball, I should say college football rankings. The college football playoff top 25 coming out a moment ago. We're glad to react to that with all of you. Of course, you see Kaylee Mansell, Connor Riley on hand here, where Georgia has come in ranked 7th, seeded 8th in this new release from the college football playoff top 25. And you know, Connor, we've kind of done some version of this each and every week. I think there's an element of this that sort of gets more and more illogical and ludicrous as time goes by. If you look at the top 12 rankings, you've got Clemson in at number 12 now. You've obviously got Tennessee and Texas both rated highly. So in the top 12 itself, Georgia's got a 31-point win against the number 12 team, convincing wins against both Tennessee and Texas, highly ranked teams. And yet somehow that only gets Georgia, at least in the eyes of the committee right now, theoretically the number 7 ranking and then number 8 seed here. There is no way to explain that. There is no way that Ward Manuel or, frankly, William Shakespeare, there's nobody that has enough command of the English language to stand up there and talk about why the Penn States, why the Notre Dames, or any team like that has a better case. Certainly not Texas. I mean, Texas may be the team that has, I guess, I have the biggest issue with of all. But nonetheless, that's released. Perhaps not, incredibly surprising. But when you see the rankings and you see what Georgia has done against those 3 highly ranked teams, the treatment of Georgia, and I don't think it's intentional like punishment or anything like that. I just think they're not smart. When you see that play out the way that it does, it's just as inexplicable as ever.
Committee doesn't watch the games. It's very much apparent. They don't watch the games. They don't factor in circumstances. They simply look at your loss column, and if you've got more than one, they're going to knock you down there. If you don't have an affiliation with the Big Ten, they're going to knock you down. Quite frankly, and look, I know Kaylee is not exactly a big fan of Notre Dame. I don't understand how Notre Dame, based on what we have seen in the body of their entire resume, is behind Penn State at this point. They've been a more impressive team in my mind over the course of the season. While, yes, they undoubtedly have the worst loss, I still think Notre Dame has a better overall resume and has looked like a better team. So this is not just a Georgia-specific complaint in that regard there. So, if you want to spin this the Georgia way, right now, look, they've got a chance at having a home playoff game. It'd be against Tennessee. Very similar situation what we saw in Sanford Stadium 2 weeks ago. But I think if you're Georgia now, and this is something I'm sure you've talked about on your show, BA, the path to an ACC championship, something fans, quite frankly, didn't want, now represents the path to getting a bye, getting a 2 seed. And if the bracket sets up as we see it right now, you're on the opposite side of facing an Oregon, of facing an Ohio State. And there's a world where if you're the 8 seed, you could have to play Oregon in the 1-8 game and then potentially Ohio State in the semifinals there and then find a way to win a national championship in that sense. So the way this sets up right now for Georgia, they got to go win the SEC championship game, and that's going to be easier said than done. But I think that they've got a path there that they very much like based on what we have seen tonight.
Kaylee, what did you think about it?
I mean, obviously there's a clear Big Ten bias. I can put my personal dislike for Notre Dame aside to agree with what Connor said. They have no reason being behind Penn State. But now it looks like you've got to win the SEC championship because, in my opinion, you're probably in the worst possible position the way you're sitting now. I mean, how are you going to have a rematch in the first round? I just quite frankly think that's a little bit ridiculous. It's a 12-team playoff. To rematch somebody that you already played this season, round 1, is a little bit beyond me. But now you potentially go face Oregon round 2, and then I feel like you're stacked on that side of the bracket. And you look at the other side, it's like Texas has the easy route to get into the national championship, but they haven't really done anything. So, I mean, I was hoping for better, but I guess the term is disappointed, but not surprised.
So from a Georgia standpoint, let me just say it this way, though. I think this is actually the least meaningful of all the rankings that have come out. And some people say none of them mean anything. I would say this one means even less than normally because the one thing that Georgia's not going to be is they're not going to be the 8th seed. They're either going to be the SEC champion in the top 4 or they're going to lose that game. And I believe, if I had to guess, I believe they're probably not playing in a home game at that point. So Georgia's either going to make the playoff near the bottom of the 12-team field, assuming they beat Tech, obviously, on Friday night. So if we assume a win against Tech, I believe that probably clinches a playoff berth for Georgia, I believe. And I think it's either going to be at the bottom of the field because of the SEC runner-up or near the top of the field because of the SEC champion. So I think there is some stuff in this top 25 ranking tonight that does have some meaning, and we'll obviously talk about that in a moment. But as it relates to Georgia, this is all very theoretical right now because Georgia's just not going to be the SEC runner-up as this projects them and still be the 8th seed. I believe, just given the fact when Georgia lost to Ole Miss the other day, they dropped them 8 spots. If Georgia loses to Texas in the SEC championship, my assumption is the committee, the fee would be a lot more punitive to Georgia than just dropping them down to number 8. So I honestly don't believe it's a very realistic possibility that Georgia ends up ranked 7th, seeded 8th. They'll either be better than that or worse than that. But I don't, kind of look at the strong likelihood of Georgia ending kind of where they are right now.
So you think that with the extra game that they would punish them and then potentially make Georgia go on the road and play Tennessee in that circumstance?
Or go on the road and play somebody. Yeah, I probably do. And I have been watching closely for the idea that would you see 2 SEC teams matched up against each other? And, would, as you point out, Georgia having to go to Neyland Stadium, I think that'd be I would just be, obscene, I think. But I just given the way that Georgia's been treated when it's lost games, I think there's a very good chance that Georgia drops below that 8 number and finds a way to not be playing one of these home games, just kind of given how some of this has played out already this season.
And I think that's the thing we don't know here is what kind of impact these conference championship games are going to have. Because right now, SMU is the last at-large team. And now while I think SMU is going to beat Miami in the ACC championship game, I do have questions about how the committee is going to value them. And let's put forth a very clear picture here. I think South Carolina is blocked behind Ole Miss and Alabama, and they lost head-to-head to both of those teams. They got their butt kicked by Ole Miss in a game that was not all that close, and they kind of tricked away that game against Alabama. But, is the committee really going to leapfrog South Carolina over Alabama and Ole Miss if they beat Clemson? I don't think they will based on the way they set things up this week. So let's say South Carolina wins that game. You start seeing the path for Alabama to get in where you have Clemson lose, and then they decide to punish SMU for losing in the ACC championship game potentially. That's how you get an Alabama in as the final at-large team there. But again, and this is something where, last week there were a lot of people screaming about Indiana, screaming about the rankings of these SEC teams and where they're going to be. I can guarantee you this. The losses are going to come. Tennessee goes on the road as a double-digit favorite this week to play Vanderbilt. We saw what happened last week when Alabama and Ole Miss did the same thing there. So the losses are going to come this week. I guarantee you right now, it could even be someone like Georgia. Someone in the top 10 of this college football playoff ranking is going to find a way to lose this week, and it's going to raffle things up once again. So if you're Georgia, it's incredibly simple for your path right now. You beat Georgia Tech this week. You win the SEC championship game over Texas A&M. You're in New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl as the 2 seed.
A couple of people pointing out in our comment section, I do believe I am wearing my daughter's headphones here tonight. I couldn't find any to plug in. I did find these, so I believe, wearing. Yes, many of you are wondering, are these my daughter's headphones? I'm pretty sure they are my daughter's headphones. Are these? I'm colorblind. Are they pink? Is that how people know that?
There's some pink and some light green.
Yeah, I am wearing my daughter's headphones. That is absolutely true. Kaylee, I think that when we had to do a playoff projection recently, I had Alabama in the field even after losing to Oklahoma. I talked about that on DawgNation Daily a good bit here this week, and I think you see where Alabama comes in tonight, ranked 13th. I think that Alabama, unfortunately, and for some people it's going to be unfortunate because they've lost 3 times now, but I do think you see Alabama still very much alive for the possibility of the playoff. My belief is unless SMU's the ACC champs, they're not getting the playoff. You can rank them first if you want to right now. Unless they're the ACC champs, I don't believe they're getting in this field. I think that door is open for Alabama. 9-3. Assuming they beat Auburn on Saturday, undeserving in the eyes of many, but you still got to put 12 teams in the 12-team playoff. And I think if you have to get to 12, it gets very hard, I believe, to get there by excluding Alabama. I just think when it's all said and done, assuming they beat Auburn on Saturday, they are likely in.
Well, I think anybody that's watched college football knows that history and the playoff history favors Alabama. And I think them putting them at 13 is very intentional because it's like, oh, well, they have 3 losses and we didn't put them in. But in watching the playoff rankings, they explained exactly what needs to happen for Alabama to get in. They're going to slide Clemson in there at 12 because it's like, oh, we don't have this Alabama bias, but they're at 13. They still have a chance. And the way things went last weekend, it's bound to happen again this weekend too. So by them saying exactly the path that Alabama needs to take to get in, like, it's very obvious that they want that to happen.
Yeah, so Connor, let me come back to you on that too, as Kaylee was talking about, maybe they want that to happen with Alabama. When you compare the potential 3 loss teams in the SEC that we know of, they're all kind of clustered near each other. Ole Miss, Alabama, South Carolina. The ironic thing here is if you actually did put South Carolina in the tournament, I think they're a really tough out right now. They've played amazing defensively all year, and over the course of the last month, Lenore Sellers has played about the best level of quarterback of anybody in the SEC. Like right now, this is a really, really good team on both sides of the ball, but they've lost the wrong 2 teams. They lost Ole Miss and they lost Alabama. Now, my logic, and tell me if you think this is too convoluted. I do believe the committee would respect head-to-head for Alabama over South Carolina. Crimson Tide would get the nod. I don't know that Ole Miss would get the same benefit of the doubt, even though Ole Miss won in Columbia and did so, not quite blowout fashion, but certainly a very convincing win. And I think the reason why is Ole Miss 3 losses all came to unranked teams. These are, their win against Georgia is a very good one. Their losses, Florida, Kentucky, and LSU, none of those losses look particularly good here right now. And I think that could serve to punish Ole Miss and perhaps not give it credit for the head-to-head win that it has against South Carolina. So if I'm stacking those 3 teams right now, I believe that Alabama would be the first in line. And to Alabama's credit, they beat Georgia. They blew out Missouri. They blew out LSU, which doesn't mean as much now, but nonetheless, they've got a collection of wins that I think are pretty impressive. The 3 losses, especially the ugly performance in Norman, clearly that doesn't look good, but if you're comparing them among equals, I think that resume is honestly, as much as it pains me to admit, probably not such a bad resume. So if you're stacking those 3 teams, I'm not including Texas A&M right now because I think their path is by beating Texas on Saturday. If you're stacking those 3 teams right now, I'd go Bama, then South Carolina. And I'd actually put Ole Miss underneath the Gamecocks if I'm thinking the way that I believe the committee will view this. What do you think about that?
I think you just spent a lot of time talking about 3 teams that aren't getting into the college football playoff.
Do you really not think Alabama's getting in?
I don't think Alabama's getting in. Like I said earlier, I think SMU is going to win the ACC. I don't think that they're going to keep Miami out in favor of Alabama because Miami is a sizable brand in that regard. And again, this Alabama isn't the Alabama of old. Nick Saban is not there. This is a team that got absolutely pantsed this past week against Oklahoma. I know that there is still this fear of Alabama out there. I think, quite frankly, that fear is why Georgia fans didn't want Georgia playing in the SEC championship game because they knew that the most likely opponent was going to be Alabama, a team that, quite frankly, they have not been able to get the job done against. In fact, beating them earlier this year. But I see the path for Alabama not getting in. If Clemson, a home favorite this weekend against South Carolina, is able to find a way to win that game, I find it very hard to see how Alabama is going to leapfrog them and get into the college football playoff field, thus making, regardless of what happens in that ACC championship game, a moot point. And so then you're going to tell me that they're going to jump Alabama over Indiana without any new data points in there? I just find that hard to believe. Not to mention, let's see Alabama go out there and win this weekend against Auburn. I know Alabama has not lost at home against Auburn since Cam Newton was the quarterback there. But this is an Alabama team that just absolutely got its butt kicked by a very physical Oklahoma team a week ago. Jalen Milroe got beat up in that game. While he did not play well, I think the physicality that Oklahoma played with in that game is a big reason why I would expect Auburn to try and do something similar this week. And they did some nice things on offense this past game. Cam Coleman has become a big presence in that offense, and Jarquez Hunter is probably playing better than any running back in the league right now. I understand why there is this fear of Alabama and seeing them sneak into the college football playoff. But even in the event that they sneak into the college football playoff and get in as that 11 seed or possibly even the 12 seed, because I think whoever wins the Big 12 is going to keep climbing up in those rankings because they're going to get a chance to get more ranked wins. They're going to be away from Georgia, and they're not going to have to play Georgia for a while. So even if Alabama does find a way to get in this playoff, which I don't think they're going to do, I don't think that there's this fear that this team is going to go on a run because we have not seen this team consistently string together great performances in back-to-back weeks.
So they certainly had some bad games. I don't dispute that. However, Kaylee, I would say that of the teams that could be in the playoff, I really only think there are 4 teams that can actually win the national championship. I'd say Oregon and Ohio State are there. I would say that Georgia's clearly there. And my 4th team I think that can still win the national championship is Alabama. And I frankly don't care how badly they play on their worst day, which it was on Saturday. I don't view a Notre Dame, a Penn State, an Indiana, maybe Texas, but honestly, I've got my doubts about Texas on the offensive side of the ball right now. I think they're better defensively than offensively. I really view Alabama, even as bad as they played on Saturday, as like my 4th of the teams that I think could win the national championship, and I'd still take them over Texas, even after everything we've seen thus far this year.
I know. It just depends on what kind of Jalen Milroe you get. I feel like it's like a coin flip. You never know what side of him you're going to get. Now, I would throw Texas in that category as well, just especially with the way that they were to somehow pull off an SEC championship win, the way the bracket lines up. I do feel like how the brackets line up at the end is definitely going to help favor some teams that maybe don't have as good of a chance as we'll exclude Alabama for this conversation. The 3 that you mentioned, Oregon, Ohio State, and Georgia. It's crazy because this is the first year of the 12-team playoff, but I don't know if they're actually 12 great teams.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, Connor, I thought tonight that some of the conversation you're seeing online, just kind of monitoring this stuff a little bit, I think is starting to move in the direction that I had sort of hoped that it would. I think people are starting to pay more attention to. If this was the theoretical field, I don't believe it will be for reasons I just said about Georgia a moment ago. I think they're either higher or they're lower. I don't believe they're 8. But what people are noticing is, okay, well, if you've got, the Big Ten champ is the 1 seed, the runner-up is the 5 seed. That's essentially the way this ranking has been since the beginning of the month. If Georgia is on the 8 line, all those teams are on the same side of the bracket now, and that's obviously ludicrous. Now, I don't know this committee is capable of processing that. I honestly don't know. Could they end up sticking the 3 best teams in the country all on the same side? Certainly, I would think it's within the realm of possibility they could do that without even knowing they're doing it. That's how inept I believe they probably are. But I do believe, though, it does kind of point to why, if you're Georgia, of course, this is an elementary point, but nonetheless, why you want to be the SEC champion. Because if you can get to the 2 seed, which I think is the most likely, or perhaps the 3 seed, you're talking about playing a team like Miami. You're talking about playing, one of these other teams, maybe Penn State. You're talking about playing the kind of path to a national championship game that I just think is pretty advantageous. So paying attention to who is seated where you'd be playing those teams, and how you would have the best possible path of getting to a national championship. I think that's what we're starting to see the evolution of this conversation be. And I do believe that's a discussion that's moving in the right direction.
But yeah, I guess maybe it's those headphones. They're not allowing you to get on your conspiracy cap here. Here's how the College Football Playoff Committee separates the bracket quite easily. Say Ohio State loses again to Oregon in the Big Ten title game, as I believe they would be probably favored to do so. What they can do is slot Penn State, a team they have kept above Notre Dame, up to that number 5 spot, drop Ohio State 1 spot to number 6, point to the precedent of, hey, we just look at losses because that's what they continue to do here. And thus they split it up to where you get Ohio State on the other side of the bracket, away from potentially that Oregon and Georgia sort of triumvirate that can be formed there. So there's a very easy path to this if the committee just has the willingness to do it. And in that scenario, I think that would involve Georgia losing in the SEC championship game there. So I think it'll be interesting there to see how that result. And again, that's, to me, the biggest unknown right now is what impact those championship games are going to have on the college football playoff rankings. I know we've talked about this before, but when you look at the NCAA basketball tournament, obviously it's a different body. College basketball tournaments, conference tournaments have almost no bearing on the way that those teams get seeded and ultimately get into the tournament. They might be a bid thief that knocks an at-large team out, but you're not winning your way to, say, the conference tournament final, losing there, and then thus getting in to the tournament based on those 3 games that you played in Kansas City, Las Vegas, Nashville, wherever your conference tournament is being held. And I wonder if there's going to be something similar with these conference championship games, where if you win it, yes, you do get a boost. In Georgia's case, you'd get to get the bye and go to the Sugar Bowl and play that game there. But are they really going to punish Georgia, drop them behind the Tennessee team they've already beaten because they had to go through and play an extra game? And if that's the case, then they're going to get rid of these conference championship games moving forward, because for as much money as they deal with, the teams that lose those home games and potentially lose spots in the college football playoff, I think hurt the leagues more than they potentially gain from those SEC championship type games there. So I think that's absolutely something to monitor here as we see this 12 team committee sort of become formed and what impact that has.
Well, there's definitely going to be some lobbying. In the case of the Big Ten, Kaylee, there may be some reverse lobbying, because if Oregon and Ohio State play twice, look, if Oregon loses the Big Ten title game, it becomes very hard to make sense of them being anywhere below kind of that 5 seed, because they've been undefeated all year long. But they probably wouldn't want to be the 5 seed for the reason that Connor just mentioned. I don't think they like the idea of having to play a third game against Ohio State, at least theoretically, in the national semifinals. I think they'd like to try their hand at somebody different at that point in time, and maybe the committee might oblige them on that. So at a certain point, these seeds become a little bit theoretical if you're not, kind of honoring the spirit of those seeds all throughout the 1 through 12. And the same thing's going to be true for the SEC too. Connor brings up a good point of, well, if Georgia were to theoretically lose the SEC championship, would you really drop them below Tennessee? Perhaps you wouldn't, but you could also very easily drop both Georgia and Tennessee below where they are right now and just sort of make up the reason why at the expense of a one-loss Indiana, Penn State, some of these teams. Because the one, I haven't done a whole lot of conspiratorial talk, all night long, but the one conspiracy I maintain more than anything else, they do not want 3 teams in the national semifinal. They do not want 3 SEC teams in the national semifinal, and they will do anything they can to keep that from happening. They will pit them against each other, as this theoretical field does with Tennessee and Georgia. They'll put them on the road. They'll stack the deck against them. And anybody who follows the college basketball tournament will tell you, I'm talking about gamblers here, they'll tell you that when you don't want a mid-major to go through the bracket and bust it all up, what do? You put one mid-major against the other, make them play each other, and that at least eliminates one of those to worry about. They'll do anything like that when it comes to this. They do not want the 4 national semifinalists remaining standing when you get to the official Final Four of this tournament. They do not want 3 of those teams to be in the SEC, and they will do anything they can to keep that from happening.
Yeah, I think when you look at the brackets from the past weeks, that's kind of been the common theme too, is to kind of pit the SEC teams against each other. So like you said, there's not going to be a 3 out of 4 SEC, because then that just proves what the SEC's been saying all along about being the best conference. But I'm with Connor and you. Like I'm most curious to see what happens with the SEC runner-up, because with this being the first year of the 12-team playoff, I feel like whatever you decide now is going to have to be the precedent that's set for the years to come. You can't do it one way this year and then do it a different way next year, because then all chaos is going to break loose. And so if you decide to punish the runner-up, of course, then no one's going to want to play in a conference championship moving forward. And everything that Lane Kiffin said is going to be true. But if you decide right now that that's not going to penalize you, then it actually gives teams something to want to be a part of and work towards that, because you know that, hey, even if I don't win, we're still going to be in a good position. So whatever they decide to do is how it's going to have to be for the rest of however long, until they add 16 teams and then 24 teams and then eventually become March Madness.
Yeah, and keep this in mind, Kaylee, we've only got one more guaranteed year of this playoff format this way. Next year is sort of the final contracted year. And I do think there's a really good chance in, what would that be, 2026? In 2026, I think there's a chance that all of this looks completely different, whether it's conference title games greatly impacted, the field expanded, the guaranteed bids that nobody seems to want, but Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti are out there sort of pushing for, whatever it is. I think that it could look wildly different 2 years from now, because the contract's only for this season and next season. And so to kind of piggyback off Kaylee's point, Connor, I think that gives the committee sort of the freedom to do whatever they want, because they can just say the next iteration of the playoff will fix whatever this is wrong. So much like last year was sort of a lame duck, the final year of the 14 playoff, and it perhaps gave the committee a little bit of freedom to behave in a way they typically might not. I think because this is such a short-term deal, and all of this, I'm talking about all of this, is so uncertain when you kind of move past the 2025 season, I think it makes their ultimate thought process perhaps even more difficult to predict of what they'll actually do when it's all said and done.
So I hear all that, but I feel like the committee, as frustratingly as it's been, has made themselves incredibly transparent on this matter. We look at the number of losses that you have, and we just rank you based on that. Because quite frankly, and look, I'm sorry to go after Indiana here. What I saw from Indiana on Saturday is not a team that is one of the 12 best in the country. While I have spent much of this time downplaying the fears of Alabama, Alabama would absolutely smoke Indiana on a neutral field here. But because Indiana got the right set of schedule and they've been able to go out there and win their games. And look, I was perhaps higher on Indiana than I would say the average person. But, BA, do you know how many yards of offense that Indiana had in the second quarter of that Ohio State game?
I do know this. They scored on a nice drive to begin the game, and they scored a garbage time drive at the end of the game, and they didn't do nothing, to use bad grammar intentionally, for the entirety of the middle portion of that game.
No, you are correct. They had 0 yards of offense in the second quarter. They had a 70-yard drive on the first drive of the game. Their last drive of consequence went for 75 yards. Sorry to bring up math here in football. It's 145 yards. They finished the game with 151 yards of offense. If we want to sit here and say these are the best 12 teams, this committee can't point to that tonight, in my opinion, and do that. And they know that, and they understand that. And so all year, and they've consistently done this, they just look at losses. They look at the number you have, and they rank you based on that. And because while I believe that Georgia is a better team than Penn State, we probably won't get a chance to see it because Penn State, being Penn State, is going to find a way to lose to a quality team before that they get a chance to potentially play Georgia. It's just the reality of the situation here. Fortunately, we only have to do this one more time. We have to hear this committee prop up these, things in these rankings and things like that before we finally get the real one. And then we can go out there and see, okay, here's how Georgia goes about advancing there, and here's how the rest of the field sits.
Yeah, I mean, Kaylee, to sort of borrow a line I've borrowed before from the famous movie, that if you're a team like Indiana and you look around the rest of this playoff field, if you can't determine who your easy win in this field would be, that means you're the easy win. And everyone's craving the chance to play Indiana. I think most teams feel the same way about Penn State. I don't feel the same way about Notre Dame that you do. I don't think that Notre Dame can win the national championship, but Notre Dame's good defensively.
When did I ever say that Notre Dame can win? Those words never.
No. You're down on. No, you're down on.
Oh, okay. I was like, hold
So
up.
my point is, while I don't believe that Notre Dame can win the national championship, I do think they're pretty good, and I think they're better than both Indiana and Penn State. I believe they're better than Miami. I believe they're probably one of the 5 or 6 best teams in the country, legitimately speaking, even though they lost Northern Illinois. Mostly that's defense for me, the reason that I feel that way. But teams like Penn State, Indiana, I would put Miami in there too. I think those are teams that are probably pretty easy wins. If you're Georgia, I think that's probably true if you're a Tennessee. I think even Texas could probably beat a few of those teams, pretty convincingly. And so a lot of this, what it is, it's not so much the question of who gets in the playoff, but once you're there, where are you seated? Where are you asked to go play? And what's your path to potentially getting to a national championship?
Well, I think that there's a very clear separation in the top 12 between actual playoff contenders and the ones that everyone else wants to play. I don't look at any of the teams outside of the ones I believe could actually win it and say, well, this team could get hot and win it. I don't think that's the case, especially with looking at the top 12 now. Clemson, Boise State, Indiana, SMU, Tennessee may be the only one that kind of falls in that middle category, but Miami, Notre Dame, Penn State, there isn't one of those teams that I look at. I'm like, you know what? If they just get on a roll and they get momentum, then yeah, maybe they can win it. I think that there is a very, 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 very clear separation between actual contenders and the ones that everyone else wants to play.
So let's get ready to, I guess, give some final thoughts here. Connor, beyond the top 12, top 13, if you want to kind of expand it or just anything that hasn't been discussed, what's a big takeaway from you for what the committee did here tonight?
If the Big 12 doesn't get the right combination of teams in their Big 12 title game, Boise State is potentially getting a first-round bye.
Yeah.
I think that they get a chance to potentially pick up a ranked win over UNLV that came in at number 22. I think is further going to help them in that regard. And, let's say it's Arizona State, Colorado. I think that might potentially help the Big 12 in that regard. But if it's certain other teams there, we're going to see a G5 team getting a Power 4 game. And I can tell you who's really not going to like that. That's Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, because they're only going to use that ammunition to further say, hey, this is why we need top 4 teams and we need to do away with automatic bids, because we have leagues like the Big 12 where things go sort of chaotic this year and end up putting a team getting a bye that Boise State, other than Indiana, I don't know is better than in this year's college football playoff field.
And the truth is, while it'd be, shocking that the big brand got diminished, the truth is if it's Iowa State or even Arizona State that win the Big 12, I mean, I hate to be this way, but are they really a bigger brand than Boise State is with the, Heisman contender and Ashton Genty and a team that's kind of been on TV a lot over the course of the last 20 years? Like, I'm not even quite so sure that you're, disrespecting the big brand if it's Iowa State or a team like Arizona State that ends up being, on the sort of the receiving end of that.
Well, look, as America's premier Arizona State talent, you've been someone who's just been doubting this Arizona State team for a long time. I'm just letting you know, do that at your own peril, because guess what? When Arizona State's in the college football playoff and Alabama isn't, we're going to be pretty good here talking about the old Sun Devils.
Fair enough. Kaylee, how about a final thought from you?
I'm just going to go off of what Connor said. I do think that Boise State getting the first round bye is becoming very real because they have been stuck at 12 for so long. And I just thought that, okay, if they don't move up from that 12 spot, even with everything happening, then they're never going to get the first round bye, no matter if they put it up on the pretty graphic in front of us. But even just that one jump from 12 to 11 makes it a very, very real possibility now that they get that first round bye, which is crazy to me. I have no idea what's going to happen with the Big 12. It is, maybe even a bigger, I almost said a cuss word on the show, can't do that, a mess than the SEC, if you will. But the Big 10 bias is still real, and now we only have one more week, and then we can finally stop, making hypotheticals, and we'll actually see it. So,
and for me, listen, I think that based on the craziness of last week's results, this week's rankings at least make a little bit more sense, with the exception of how Georgia was treated. I think they make a little bit more sense because a lot of SEC teams lost. But if this really were to be closely resembling what the actual field is, then and you're talking about an absolute failure of the SEC agreeing to a format like this that would have. Right now you essentially have as many playoff contending teams in the ACC as you do the SEC, even though the league is nowhere. It's not even within 5 standard deviations of what the SEC, but somehow this committee is almost treating the ACC and the SEC as if they're similar. Only 3 SEC teams would get in the playoff right now. 2 of those would have to play each other in the first round. And the team that's the sort of, biggest beneficiary of all of this is a Texas team that has literally played no one. So I think the SEC has agreed to a format that's penalizing its strength here right now. And at a certain point, I would certainly hope that Greg Sankey's fighting against this privately. It'd be nice if he also spoke out about it at some point in time publicly. But the SEC strength as a league is not being reflected in how this committee talks about college football. And yes, the SEC teams are getting more losses, but they're also playing tougher games, more entertaining. It's a better brand of football, but it's not a great fit for the college football playoff. And if at a certain point in time, if it can't be recognized what makes the SEC different than these other leagues, then I don't know how much sense it makes for us to all try to come together underneath the same umbrella for the college football playoff. But that's obviously a bigger topic for a different day. For now, we are reinforced what we've always thought, which is, or at least what we've been thinking for the last 2 days. What are you shaking your head at, Connor?
Oh, Kaylee's just looking at her phone.
I was looking at the rankings. I could pull it up.
For now, we will reinforce what we've been saying for most of the last 2 days. If Georgia wins the SEC, Georgia's got a pretty nice path to the playoff that certainly would not give you too much reason to complain. But if Georgia somehow loses in Atlanta, or heaven forbid in Athens on Friday night, I don't expect that to happen, but certainly in Atlanta next Saturday, then at that point in time, the Dogs have left it in the hands of the committee, and you probably have to get what you get and not pitch fit if that's what ends up happening here. So Georgia's got some real work to do to make sure they are where they want to be on the other side of Championship Saturday. Good stuff from Connor, Riley, and Kaylee Mansell. We hope you all are getting ready for a very happy Thanksgiving. I'll see you tomorrow morning for DawgNation Daily. We'll talk more about this and kind of what's next for Georgia as all this plays out while the team continues its preparation for Georgia Tech and clean old-fashioned 8. Busy week, fun time for college football. Georgia right in the thick of the college football playoff conversation, and that is certainly something that's very fun to consider. So have a great night, everybody. We'll see you back here next week for the final rankings prior to the real ones as the college football playoff top 25 comes out fresh and new. But for now, we'll say goodnight